Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to church. If we haven't met, my name is Jason, and I'm one of the pastors here, and I am so honored you would take time out of your weekend to join us today for church. Would you do me a favor? We're one church that meets in 2 locations, and lots of people join us online. Would you welcome your church family as they join us today, everybody? We love you guys so much. So glad to be with you. Now, if you're part of our church, you know this. We always teach in message series, but today I wanted to hit pause on the series for just 1 week to bring you a message that I really believe God has for us called Prepared. You see, the reality is so many of us either go through storms or we're going to go through storms. And the truth is we need to figure out how do we prepare ourselves for when the storms inevitably are going to come. Now, if you're around our church, you know this. We call this the best day of the week. And the reason it's the best day of the week, it isn't because of me, it's because of you. Because we gather together, and what we believe is when we gather together in Jesus' name, everyone's welcome and nobody's perfect, but anything is possible. And I'm so glad that you're with us today. Yeah, you ever have a day that just didn't go the way you expected the day to go? You ever have this? Some years ago, I was with my daughter, Ella, and we were at the Florida Mall in Orlando, which is this huge, big mall, and we were just having a good dad-daughter day. We got cookies at the Great American Cookie Company. We bought a bear at Build-A-Bear, which costs way too much money, but she's worth it, and so we went there. And then Ella told me she needed to use the restroom. Now, she was kind of in the middle of potty training, and you don't mess around with that, so we hustled to the restroom, but she was getting to the age where I just felt weird taking her into the men's restroom, because, guys, you're super gross. And so I take her, and there's a family restroom, and I'm like, this is perfect, like a little single restroom unit. And so I take her in, she does her thing, and I have this thought, well, since we're here, I might as well go too. So I sit down, and no more than 5 seconds after sitting down, I have that moment. You ever have a moment where you're in a restroom and you're just doing your thing and someone knocks on the door? Have you ever had that moment? And you just feel the sense of panic. Like, what do I do? What do I say in the moment? And then the person, they made it worse because they jiggled the handle really hard, and it's just like, oh, it's such a gross feeling. And then the person on the other side of the door said, hello. And Ella, my little, probably 2.5-year-old goes, I'll get it. And she opens the door. And that moment between I'll get it and her hand being on the door, it probably was 1 second, but it felt like an eternity. I was like, no. And she just in one fluid motion grabs the door and slams it open. And there's this sweet old lady standing on the other side of the door. She must have just had her hair done because she had one of those those neoprene hair covers that you get over her hair. And she looks at me and her jaw drops and she goes, oh, don't worry, honey, I've seen it all. And my therapist and I are still working through that, whatever that means. Ethel's seen some stuff in her day, apparently. And anyways, I wouldn't classify that day as a perfect day. That wasn't even a good day. That was a weird day or an embarrassing day. All of us have had moments that we can recall. And in the moment we recall it, we feel the nervousness, we feel the grossness, we feel the embarrassment of the moment. We all have those moments. Some of us have days, and we just wish we could go back and just erase the day from memory. The kind of day where you're ready to go to bed at 6:30 at night, not because you're tired, but because you just want the day to end, right? We've had those days. We've had weeks that are hard weeks. We've had months that we just really wish we could go back and forget. But some of us have had seasons of our life, whole seasons of our story that we wish we could go back and change or undo. And the reason is it was just hard. It was difficult. Like maybe the best way to categorize it is it was just a storm in our life. And the question I want to wrestle with today is this. Well, what do you do when the storms of life are crashing in on you? Well, what do you do when the storms of life are crashing in on you? Now, this is important for 2 reasons. Number 1 is it rhymes. And if it rhymes, it's got to be important. Number 2 is the storms are going to come. If you're having a wonderful day and a wonderful month and a wonderful season, the reality is there's going to be a day when you get a phone call There's going to be a day when a relationship feels like it's hanging on by a thread. There's going to be a day when there's more month than there is money to afford the month. Do you know what I mean? Like there's just going to be some difficult days and some difficult seasons in your life. So what do? When the storms of life are crashing in on you. Now, to talk through this today, I want to talk through one of my favorite stories in the Bible. It's found in Mark chapter 4. If you grew up going to church, you've probably heard this story. Jesus does a lot of fascinating miracles in his day. Prays for people who are sick and they get better. He multiplies food like a little boy's lunch of bread and fish and feeds thousands of people. He turns water into wine. He walks on water. He does amazing miracles. And in Mark chapter 4, there's this fascinating story. Now, the way the author Mark writes the story is interesting because in Mark chapter 1, he starts by saying the reason for this whole letter is I want you to know that Jesus is God. Like he wants to paint this picture for us that Jesus is who he says he is. He is the Son of God who put on flesh and blood and stepped into humanity for us. And he paints this beautiful picture. The first few chapters of Mark, we read some of the most amazing miracles of him healing sick and raising the dead. But Mark chapter 4 is fascinating because he's going to tell us a story of Jesus, who is creator of the world, who flexes his muscle and shows his power over his own creation. It's just this beautiful story. Now here's what you need to know. In the ancient Jewish mind, prophets prayed for people and God did miracles and they got well. So God did the miracle. But the ancient Jews believed that if you were to claim that you had power over nature itself, that was an offense punishable by death. It's this fascinating way of thinking, and Jesus does this miracle that seems impossible. We're going to start in Mark chapter 4. Here's the first verse of the chapter. It says, again, Jesus began to teach by the lake, and the crowd that gathered around him was so large that he got in a boat and sat on it out on the lake. And this is why all the people were along the shore at the water's edge. Now here's what you need to know from the beginning of this chapter. Word of Jesus is spreading. Everyone wants to hear or see what he's going to do or say next. And in an era where there was no social media, no newspapers, no mass media, word about Jesus was spreading like wildfire through the eastern Galilee region. And Jesus was doing all kinds of miracles and doing all kinds of things. And everyone wanted to see what he was going to do next. So Jesus was pressed up against the Sea of Galilee, and there were crowds, multitudes of people who wanted to experience what Jesus had to offer. So Jesus gets in a boat and he pushes back off of the shore just a little bit. And I think he accomplished two things. Number one is he gave himself just a little bit of breathing room. But number two is he used the natural acoustics of the water at his feet and the mountains to the back of the audience to project his voice so that more people could hear what he was going to say. So after a long day of ministry, if you read the rest of Mark chapter 4, he does all kinds of teaching about seeds and mustard seeds and faith. It's just this fascinating chapter, but he's done. It says the end of the day is near, and I want to read the story of a miracle, and I want to ruin the story for you by reading the end of the story. Then I want to come back and I want to explain what it means to you and to me. Mark chapter 4, verse 35. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." So leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. Then a storm comes. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped, and Jesus was in the stern. He was in like the captain's seat, but he was sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" But Jesus gets up, he wakes up from his nap, and he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. And so Jesus says to his disciples, why are you so afraid? Like, what are you doing? Do you still have no faith? Verse 41, they were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves, they obey him." Even the wind and the waves obey him. Now, if you knew the story going in, you know the end of the story. I don't know if you've ever been to a movie or a play where you just kind of know how it's going to end, and so it kind of ruins it for you. Some years ago, my wife and I were in New York City, and we went to a Broadway show called West Side Story, and I'm not much of a Broadway guy. I don't know anything about Broadway. I can tell you every starting lineup player for the Dallas Cowboys for like the last decade, but I don't know anything about Broadway. And so we go, and at the end, there's this dramatic scene where one of the main characters gets shot, and I wasn't expecting it. And so the guy gets shot, and I go, "Ugh." And I'm the only one who goes, "Ugh." And everyone looks at me like I'm some sort of idiot. Well, come to find out, the play's like 20-something years old, and everybody knows he gets shot. Ain't nobody told me nothing. I didn't know anything. But if I were to go see it now, if I were to rewatch it today, I wouldn't be shocked at the end because I know how it's going to go. In the same way, you know the end of the story. Jesus calms the storm, but here's what I want to challenge you to do. For the next couple minutes, I want you to put yourself back in the story. I want you to try to imagine that you're one of the disciples, you're with Jesus, you're in the boat, and you don't know how the story is going to unfold. Now let's go back to the beginning of the story, Mark 4, verse 35, and I want to pause a lot and explain what's going on here in the story. It says, that day when evening came, he said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side. Now, this is a fascinating phrase because of a lot of reasons. The first reason is this: Jesus has just been teaching all day. He's got to be physically and emotionally depleted. I know that after I teach for a day at church, usually I want to go home and just catch a quick nap just because I'm drained from all the teaching, but all the conversations. And Jesus did it all day. Like the next verse we're going to read, that after he's helped the crowd, which means he literally did everything he could to meet every need of the crowds, the multitudes of people there. So he's probably physically, emotionally, even maybe spiritually a little depleted from all that he's given out in this day. And he says, let's go to the other side. Now, here's what you need to know. He was on the coast of the Sea of Galilee. Here's a picture of what the Sea of Galilee looks like. If you can imagine, the Mediterranean Sea would be off here to your left. And Jesus did most of his life and most of his ministry in this region, which is called Galilee. On the other side of this sea, the Sea of Galilee, is this area that is known as the Decapolis. It's this city or this area of 10 major cities, and it was a very Gentile-run area, which simply means that they were not God-fearing Jews like the people from Galilee. That we know from history and extra-biblical sources that those people that lived in Decapolis and in that area, they had all kinds of pagan rituals involving sexuality and honestly involving pigs, and good Jewish people wanted nothing to do with pigs. They were seen as unclean. And so to somehow mix those worlds into one weird convoluted mess, no good Jewish boy would ever cross the Sea of Galilee into that region. And Jesus is like, let's go to the other side, right? That's what Jesus does. He crosses to the other side. Now, what I love about Jesus is this: Jesus invites all of us to cross to the other side. You may say, what does that mean? For some of you, it might just mean getting on a plane and crossing to the other side of the world to share God's love. It might mean crossing the street to introduce yourself to the neighbor who's lived there for 2 years that you don't have a relationship with. It might mean crossing the living room to make amends for an argument you've been having with your spouse. I don't know what it means for you to cross over, but he invites all of us to cross over. And in doing so, what he teaches us is this. He teaches us that he also loves the people who are on the other side. Like, that's what he does. He just loves everybody. He loves every single person who is on the other side. I also believe that God invites us to cross to the other side of certain things in our life that are holding us back, to cross to the other side of our fear, to cross to the other side of our anxiety, to cross to the other side of our depression or our suicidal thoughts or our addictions or our habits. He just invites us to the other side. And here's what I know about the other side. I don't know what yours is. I just know that the other side is usually on the other side of our comfort zone. It's really easy to stay the same. It's really hard to trust him through the process of what it takes to change. And so God invites us to the other side, and Jesus says, guys, let's get in the boat and let's go to the other side. In verse 36, it says this: leaving the crowd behind. And this doesn't mean he was just like, all right, guys, 5 o'clock, I'm done. It's like when he's done with everything he had to do, they took him along just as he was in the boat. And then there's this weird, innocuous statement. There were also other boats with him. Kind of a weird moment. Why does the author need to say that to us? But I believe there's two special thoughts here in those words. The first thing is this: the book of Mark is an eyewitness account of the life and the teachings and the miracles of Jesus. There's lots of other extra biblical stories and writing of the life of Jesus, but often they read more like a theology book or a series of events like a history book. Mark's is more like an eyewitness. He's like, I was there. He said, let's go to the other side. There were some other boats around us. That's one thought. The other thought is this: if you know the end of the story, you know that Jesus is going to do a miracle, and he does the miracle for the 12 who are in the boat. But when he does the miracle for the 12 who are in the boat, who else does it affect? All the other people who were around him in the boats surrounding them. So I believe this: your trust, your faith, your obedience in God has massive ramifications, not just to you and to your life and to your future, but also to the people who are in the figurative boats of life surrounding you. So God does this amazing thing. He says, I want to do this miracle. Jesus is in the boat with the disciples, and it's going to affect a bunch of people. And then the storm comes, because the storm always comes. Inevitably, the storm will rage in your life. In verse 37, a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Now, here's what you need to know. The Sea of Galilee is in this interesting area. Scientists have studied it for generations because it is a huge freshwater lake of water that sits 700 feet below sea level. It is teeming with fish and life. And these disciples, more than 7 of them were fishermen. So they were used to being out on the Sea of Galilee. But surrounding the Sea of Galilee on many sides are mountaintops, some of them that peak out at 9,200 feet in the air. So try to think about this. If you can go back to like 6th grade science for a moment, the cold air coming over the top of these mountains mixes with the warm air in the valley here, there where the lake is. And when those fronts happen to collect, what happens is massive storms. This isn't like one random storm that happened on a random Thursday. This happens all the time there. In fact, if you were to go to the Sea of Galilee today, on the western side of the Sea of Galilee, there's many restaurants that are built, but they're built up on stilts. And the reason they are is they know that a storm can happen, and it can happen really quick. And when a storm happens, you better get out, and if your building is built low, it is going to be flooded. Like, that's how the Sea of Galilee is. Now, if these guys were fishermen, these disciples, they grew up doing life out on this lake. Certainly they've lived through some storms, but it says this storm breaks, and all of a sudden it's so bad that the boat is beginning to fill with water. Certainly it had to feel like it was capsizing. Now, in an era where there was no cell phones, no iPhones, no Polaroid cameras, there was no digital cameras, we don't have pictures of it, but in the 1600s, Rembrandt painted this picture. It's called Christ in the Storm, and here is this picture. He paints this 400-ish years ago, and you probably can't tell because of the distance, but they're all fighting for survival, and what you see in their faces is panic. You see this sense of like, well, this is it. I wish I would have kissed my mama goodbye. I didn't know today was going to be my last day. I thought we were just going to the other side, but that's all that was happening. And then the verse goes on. This is interesting. I think for so many of us, what we wish is we wish that we had this beautiful, easy life. A life free of problems, a life that is defined by miracles. Wouldn't you like to live a life full of miracles? That's what we want. But the truth is, if you read the life of Jesus, all of Jesus' miracles exist because there was a problem. Like, Jesus doesn't do miracles for people who don't need miracles. Like, he doesn't heal people who are well. Like, Jesus doesn't open the ears of someone who can hear, right? He doesn't raise the person from death who is actually still alive. Like, none of that happens. Miracles always happen on the other side of a massive problem. And I think what we wish is, that there wouldn't be storms in life. I think what we wish is we didn't have moments that looked like the guys in the boat in this painting. I think that's what we want, but you can't have both. You can't have a scotch-free, beautiful, easy life and a life that is defined by the miracle power of God. You just can't have both. Jesus never promised that life would be perfect and easy. In fact, John 16:33, one of the most beautiful, depressing, and heroic verses in the Bible, Jesus says this. He says, I've told you these things so that in me you may have what? Peace. Peace, not based on your circumstances, not based on the storm that is brewing and rolling around you, not based on that, but you may have peace that has nothing to do with your circumstances, and it has everything to do with what has happened inside of you. In this world, you will have trouble. Now, if that was the end of the verse, that would be horrifying, but he goes on, but take heart. In the midst of your storm, have courage. In the midst of a life that doesn't seem to make any sense, in a season that feels like everything around you is shaken and nothing stands, in the middle of the squalls of your life, take heart. Why? I have overcome the world. The book of Romans says the same power that raised Christ from the dead is alive inside of you. If it's alive inside of you, think about the energy, think of the power, think of what it would take to raise someone from the dead. That's alive inside of you. If that same power is alive inside of you, I just believe that whatever's happening around you doesn't have to rock who you actually are. But Jesus is in the boat, and the disciples are panicking because there's a storm, and this is a different kind of storm than they've ever seen. And look what Jesus is doing. Next verse 38. Jesus was in the stern. He was in the driver's seat. He was in the captain's spot, but he was sleeping on a cushion. Now, the fact that the author gives us the word cushion just to me implies that Jesus knew the storm was going to come. Like, for example, if you're God and you were over all of creation, certainly you can predict when a storm is going to come. So Jesus brings what he needs in order to catch a nap. It says Jesus was in the driver's seat, but he was asleep. Now, if there's a simple takeaway from today's message, it's this, is that when your full trust and your full hope is in Jesus, when the same power that raised Christ from the dead is alive inside of you, no matter what's happening around you, you can have the inner fortitude and the inner peace to rest. In a season where everyone around you is restless, you can have the fortitude to rest. In fact, your homework today is go home and get you a nap. Like, go home and get some rest. Why? Because whatever's happening around you shouldn't rock the core of who you are. It shouldn't affect who you are. It shouldn't change what you do. So Jesus is resting. He's asleep in the boat. And what do the disciples do? The disciples, they woke him up and they said to him, "Teacher," now call time out here. So they wake Jesus up. He's asleep and they wake him up and they say, "Teacher." Now they could have used any word here. They could have said Messiah, Savior, God, anything. They could have said anything at all to Jesus, but they used teacher, which just implies maybe you don't have all the power. Maybe you're just good with your words. Maybe you're a good orator. Maybe people are just drawn to the way you put sentences together. Maybe that's all you are. Teacher, they say, don't you care if we drown? You ever had this moment with God? You ever had this moment with God? Like, God, are you awake? God, do you know what's going on? Do you see what's happening in my life? When I was a kid, going to Sunday school as a kid, we used to sing this song. It says, he's got the whole world in his hands. And I'm not going to destroy you with the rest of that song with my voice, but we sing God has the whole world in his hands. But you ever have that moment where it feels like there's over 7 billion people in the world, and if he has me in his hands, he has no idea I exist? You ever have that? I think that those thoughts are actually the key that the enemy uses to distract you from the plan and purposes of God for your life. Look at this. Like, this is how the enemy works. The first thing is he has us question the power of God. You're asleep. Can't you do anything about this? Can't you intervene in the situation? Can't you do something? Can't you wave a magic wand? Is there anything you can do, Jesus, in this moment? So he has us question the power of God, but then secondly, maybe more importantly, is his question the goodness of God, the character and the nature of who God is. So God, you're powerful. You made the world. So what? Do you care about me? The disciples are in the boat, and they're not thinking about the people in the other boats. They're thinking about home. They're thinking about getting back to mama's cooking. They're thinking about life as they know it, and they're concerned in that moment, not about everyone else. Their whole concern is, I'm going to die. Do you care? This is what they asked Jesus. So they wake him up, and they're struggling with the stuff we struggle with. And verse 39 is fascinating. It says he got up, time out. This language in Greek is this interesting language, which literally means to rise again. It's kind of foreshadowing what Jesus is going to do on the cross. In the greatest storm, the darkest hour of humanity, what does Jesus do? He rises again from the dead. So he gets up, and then he rebukes the wind. Now this is interesting because the word rebuked is this word that superiors use with people who are underneath them. Bosses rebuke employees for consistently being late. Coaches rebuke the teammate who cost their team the game because he was being selfish and not playing with the team. Parents rebuke their kids for not obeying and following the rules set forth in the household. And Jesus gets up, and as one with authority over nature, he rebukes. From a place of authority, he speaks down to nature. He says to the wind and the waves 2 things: quiet, be still. Now in Greek, this phrase is a verb of continuance, which means it's not just like stop. He's saying stop and be stopped. Stop and continue to be done. It's like a parent saying you're in trouble and go to timeout. The continuation keeps happening. Like this is going to keep going on. Jesus says 2 things. He says quiet, be still. And I want you to notice the wind dies and it was completely calm. 2 things happen. He says, quiet, be still, and the wind dies and it's calm. So here's what happens. Jesus says to the storm stop, and the storm stops. But if you know the basics of nature, what would happen is the storm would stop, but the ripple effect in the waves would continue on potentially for hours. But Jesus says, quiet, be still, and what happens? The storm stops and the waves stop. In the same way, I believe that when Jesus speaks to you and when he speaks to me, he offers us the same language. Quiet, be still, which means may your circumstances around you change, or may what's inside of you change. I would say it to you like this. Sometimes Jesus calms the storm around us, and other times he calms the storm in us. Sometimes when Jesus intervenes, what he does is he changes what's happening in your circumstances, and yet other times what he does is in the midst of the storm, he says, I am with you. I will be your strength. I will be your God. I will be your guide, and I will be with you in this moment. Verse 40, he goes on and says, he says to his disciples, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? It's like what Jesus does is he attacks the fear that they have, and the reason is our fear establishes the boundaries of our freedom. If you're afraid of heights, you'll always stay low. If you're afraid of drowning, you'll never get into water. If you're afraid of intimacy, you'll never find yourself risking. Like fear establishes the boundaries of your freedom, and I believe that you and I were created to be free. Jesus is like, why are you afraid of all this? Like, I'm literally with you, physically present in the boat. Don't you know me? Don't you trust me? Why are you afraid? Why are you fearful? I want you to notice the transition that happens, verse 41. They were terrified, and they said to each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Now, time out again for just a moment. This is interesting. When the storm is brewing all around them, it says they're afraid. They have fear. But then what happens? Jesus calms the storm. He calms the wind and the waves, to which I'd be like, oh, thank goodness. I'm so happy you're here, Jesus. But instead, when they see that, they are terrified. They're afraid of the wind and the waves, but all of a sudden they fall in, and they're just completely consumed by the power that Jesus exhibits here in this moment before them. Now, we are not to live a life characterized by fear. But in my opinion, the other way the enemy works, and the way that's showcased here in this story, is he causes us to live in the wrong kind of fear. You see, you don't need to live in fear of what's happening circumstantially around you, but I do believe that you need to live with the healthy fear of the Lord. You say, what does that mean? The book of Revelation chapter 1, John has this encounter with Jesus after Jesus has left and gone back to heaven. And John, who called himself the one Jesus loves, John, the one who was so close and connected to Jesus, he experiences Jesus, and it's like he has a nervous breakdown because of how great and awe-inspiring Jesus is. That's what happens in this moment. The book of 1 John 4 says that there is no fear in love, because perfect love casts out all fear. That's what God and his love does for us. It casts out fear. Proverbs 9:10 says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. If I'm just honest, we live in a culture where we want to live a life that's free of fear, but also free from having to be submitted. And what you discover when you discover a close, intimate relationship with Jesus is he calms the fears of everything happening circumstantial around you when you find yourself fearful, in awe, in wonder of who he is. So go back, if you would, please, to the last verse we just read. They have this moment where they're terrified. They have the wrong kind of fear. And they ask this question that I think we need to land with today, which is, who is this? The question that you and I need to come to terms with. Who even is this? Who is it that has authority over nature and has the potential to calm the storms inside of me? Who is it? It's Jesus. What's fascinating is earlier in the book of Mark, even the demons know who Jesus is, and his own disciples, who are the closest to him, even those guys, they're like, we don't even know you. Who are you in this moment? And this is the answer you and I have to come to terms with. You want to live a life characterized by peace? You have to understand who Jesus is. The best way I can explain all of this is to tell you a story from my own life. 6 months into marriage, I married this beautiful Italian girl named Liz. Life was good. We were happy. I was out traveling, serving the Lord, doing camps. And in the middle of my summer, Liz called me and she goes, I found this weird bruise thing on my leg. And so she went to the doctor because it was weird and it was raised, and the doctor did a test and sent her to another doctor who sent her to another doctor. We didn't think anything of it. It looked like a weird bruise or a pulled muscle or something. And so she flew out this weekend to come just see me, and I've been traveling, speaking at camps. And I was with her when she got the phone call. We were standing in the parking lot of a camp where I just spoken to hundreds of kids about the love of God. And I'm standing there and I can't hear the whole conversation. I can just make out words, but I hear this phrase, I'm so sorry, it's cancer. I remember in the moment I was standing with her face to face while she was on the phone, and my arms went underneath her and she just fell limp into my arms. The next week had to be the hardest week of my wife's life. It was certainly the weirdest, strangest week of my life. There was no storm in my life to that point that I had walked through. I put Liz on a plane. She came home. I couldn't get out of the next camp that I had to go to. She went home and went through a whole battery of tests. I went to speak at a camp. Every night I cried myself to sleep. Every night I had fights with God. God, where are you? Are you good? Can you do something? Why don't you do something? Where are you? I mean, I had R-rated language conversations with God. God, I have no idea where you are in this moment. I remember I caught a flight home. I was able to leave the camp one day early. Thursday night, I got home and I sat with Liz. Been married 6 months. I held her hand and we prayed together. And I'll never forget the prayer because it really was the prayer that shaped us to start what became Access. I held her hand And I prayed, God, may we never forget the feeling we feel now. May we never forget the fear. May we never forget the fear that we feel so we can help people who are fearful. May we never forget what it feels like to feel helpless so we can help those who feel helpless. God, may we never forget how we feel here and now in this moment. Well, she started chemo the next day, and through a whole series of chemo, like God miraculously carried her through it. But my story is a couple weeks later, I had a meeting with a counselor. And this guy is one of those guys who pops up in my life at some of the weirdest moments. He's the guy who I won't talk to for 2 years, but he'll just call me and say, hey, God laid you on my heart. And it's always something that God wants to say specifically to me. So I sit down with him and he goes, what's going on? I said, here's what's going on. And I went off on him. I went off. I mean, my language was inappropriate. I was so angry at God and the situation in life and just everything that was happening was it was a storm. And he said this to me. He said, Jason, this is going to be hard for you to understand now, but I want to tell you this. Every person goes through challenging seasons. They have storms in their life. And these storms are storms that God uses to accomplish something in our life. You see, God gets more done in the difficult, turbulent storm seasons in our life than any other season. Because the difficult seasons, we turn to God. When things are good, what do? We casually drift away. And he said, Jason, if you'll lean into God in this season, what will happen is he will carve out of you the capacity to know him and to trust him in a different, more intimate kind of way. He also said, God won't let this be wasted. About 2 years ago, I was just home doing my thing, and that man called me. He's always called me in weird seasons of my life, and he called me to check in and see how things were going, and we talked for 10 or 15 minutes. And then he told me the reason he called. He goes, this is weird, but my daughter was just diagnosed with cancer. She's the same age as Liz was when she got cancer. And I was just wondering if you could somehow help me through this, help me process it. And I said to him, I said, there was this day when a sage, older man in my life said to me that God will use these difficult storms in our life to carve out of us the capacity to trust him. And then he and I are both like ugly crying, snot, just ugly. You could just tell through the phone. It was not a pretty cry. But here's the point. The point is, if you find yourself in the middle of a storm, it gives you two options. You either turn from God, the only one who can help you and who can calm you in the situation, or you lean into him. And when you lean into him, what you discover is you discover his goodness and you discover his power and you discover that even when things don't make sense, he makes sense of it all. Maybe you find yourself in a storm of a season of your life and it feels like everything is against you. What you discover when it feels like the world is against you, that you have a God that is for you. So what would it look like if in this season that you find yourself in a storm, what would it look like if you and I made the decision, God, I'm leaning into you. God, even when it doesn't make sense, I trust you. God, when the storm feels like it's raging all around me, thank you that only you give me the peace that passes all understanding. It changes everything for you. So I want to end with this question. It's the same question the disciples asked, which is, who is this? Do you know who Jesus really is? You see, I believe if you did, you would live with a different sense of awe, a different sense of fear and respect and wonder at the power of who he is. Maybe instead of praying this week, God, look how big my storm is, maybe this week you need to start praying, God, you're so big. My storm is so small. Storm, check out how big he is. Isn't that amazing? It changes everything for you. Would you bow your head and would you close your eyes with me? Let's pray. God, thank you that you are so much bigger. You're so much greater than the storms that we walk through in our life. God, I just know in a room this size, some of us we're in a season that is so nasty. Everything feels like it's against us. Finances are tough, relationships are falling apart. Health feels like it's deteriorating. Life just feels like one storm after the other. God, for those of us who are in this storm season, we thank you that you are good and thank you that you are strong. You're good enough to take care of us. You're strong enough to meet our needs. And so we trust that you do have the whole world in your hands and you have my world. You have our world in the palm of your hands. So God, we lean in. We trust you. Thank you for your peace. In Jesus' name.